So we'll start with basically looking at why zero trust is again in focus. So we know zero trust has been around for many, many years, for almost 10 years. We're talking about zero trust, but it's back in focus recently. We'll talk about what is zero trust. So if you are new to the concept, we'll touch about what the zero trust concept is about. We'll talk about why zero trust is abused. So essentially, why has it become a marketing term, just a buzzword, and what is the reason behind it? And we'll talk about why is the existing parameter-based security broken? What are the zero trust principles? What are the 5 pillars of implementing zero trust? We'll talk about zero trust capabilities and the maturity models. And then finally, we'll talk about how do we actually go about implementing zero trust within the enterprise. So what's the journey for zero trust looks like? And talk about some key considerations for you to consider, and then wrap it up with a summary. And then we can have a Q&A session. So zero trust, back in focus. So you may have heard on the 12th of May, the US president, he issued an executive order which directed all the US federal agencies to adopt zero trust architecture. So why is the US president talking about zero trust? And we know this basically happened after the Colonial Pipeline attack that happened, after which the US president then issued this order. And very clearly in the order, it was mentioned that the federal agencies, they now need to adopt zero trust. And we're seeing more and more organizations and governments around the world moving towards zero trust. So just in October, just a couple of months ago, Singapore announced that it's basically a cybersecurity strategy, which states that the Singapore government will move towards the zero trust model. And what we have seen, what recently with the COVID-19 pandemic, that has been really the catalyst to accelerate the adoption of zero trust across the world, where the organizations are trying to provide secure remote access to the employees. The employees are no longer within the network, within the corporate office. So they're working from anywhere, and they want to provide an alternative for their employees to securely access their applications. So this basically has been the recent focus since the last couple of years. And with the recent types of attacks that are happening, with the Colonial Pipeline attack, with the SolarWinds, we are seeing more and more focus back on the zero trust. So much so that now people are saying it's no longer a nice to have. It has been there for almost a decade, right? When in 2010, Forrester coined this word zero trust. But since then, people have tried and failed and tried to actually adopt zero trust. The technologies have been evolving. But now even the US president is talking about it. The US government has saying it's now going to adopt zero trust. So it's now become a necessity. It's pretty much here. And I think it's an area which we all need to have a good grasp of. So what is zero trust? So we know that there are lots of interpretations of zero trust. I think I'll just take the definition from NIST. So NIST basically has this document SP 800-207, which describes zero trust as being a collection of concepts and ideas designed to minimize the uncertainty in enforcing accurate, least privileged per request access decisions in information systems in the face of a network being viewed as compromised. So you can basically consider what this particular definition, though it's a mouthful, if we dissect this definition, what it is saying is that firstly, zero trust is an enterprise security model. Yeah, it's a concept, it's ideas. You can call it a methodology, you can call it a strategy, you can even call it a mindset, but it's based on a set of principles. But it is not a particular product or a technology. So don't be going that this zero trust particular solution is actually going to solve all your zero trust problems. Zero trust is basically a set of enterprise security model based on a set of principles, but it's not a particular technology. And the idea behind zero trust is that you remove any inherent trust from the network or from the users sitting behind the network or anywhere, devices and applications. So there's no implicit trust in the network. And the trust needs to be explicitly established and continuously verified. So what does that mean? In security, trust is a very important concept. If two entities, they need to talk to each other, they need to exchange information, they need to trust each other. Previously, what had happened was that we trusted the network, the corporate network. So if you are in the corporate network, you can send information, the user is considered trusted, the device is considered trusted. But now we are saying that that's no longer the case. As we will see in the next few slides, how the technologies have changed, the parameter is no longer there, and we're talking about attacks which are happening inside our network. So the trust needs to be explicitly established. We're going to remove the trust from the network. But if you're not going to trust the network, how are we going to establish that trust? That will be based on a strong set of authentication that needs to happen, not just considering a password, but considering a range of factors, your identity, your device, your location, your behavior, and making a dynamic risk-based decision of whether to allow the access or not to allow the access. That is the concept of zero trust. So keep in mind, zero trust does not mean no trust. In fact, it actually increases the trust by actually evaluating a range of factors and not putting any inherent trust in the network or any entity in the network. So why is zero trust abuse? Why is we seeing this becoming a marketing term? It's because firstly, there's a lack of understanding about zero trust. So many of the security leaders, the CISOs, they lack understanding about what zero trust is and how do they begin the journey. Where do they start? What they're doing is they are basically selecting a particular product or a technology, and they are then looking for the problem that they need to solve. So they're selecting a solution before they have identified the problem or the use case that they need to solve. Secondly, it's basically there's no industry standard or specification. So that NIST document, the SP 800-207, is the closest to an industry guideline around zero trust. There's a lot of vendor material available, but there's no real industry standards or specifications until now. More will come now with the US government saying that it's now adopting zero trust. We're seeing more and more standards and specifications to come in the future. Each vendor providing its own interpretation. So obviously each vendor wants to sell their product. They try to describe their own way of solving a specific problem. And obviously we know that zero trust is such a vast area. There's no single vendor that can provide all the capabilities to implement zero trust. And the fact that zero trust basically encompasses such a large number of technologies. So we are talking about securing the identity, the device, the network, the application, and the data. There is no one product that will be able to solve this. And because there's such large number of capabilities, there's a lot of confusion about where to start and what particular area to target. And also there are various ways to solve the same problem. So you need to provide secure remote access to your employees. There are various ways in which you can do it. And that's the resulting in a confusion about zero trust. And the last point, it's an emerging market. So even though the concept has been there for 10 years, we are seeing new and new technologies coming in. The technologies are evolving, the solutions are evolving, and that's the reason why there is this continuous, basically, confusion about which particular solution to adopt. So why do we need zero trust? What is the problem? So let's talk about that. So traditionally, we had more a parameter-based kind of a security model, where everything resided in the corporate network. So you had basically heavily investing on your perimeter. So you were investing in your firewalls, your IDS, IPS, your WAF solutions, and so on. And everything that was sitting inside the network was being considered as trusted. So we had devices, we had applications, users, data, all sitting inside the network. And as long as they were within the network, we considered them to have the same level of trust. So it's pretty much like a flat network. And anything outside the perimeter, it was considered as untrusted. So the investment, the focus was on the perimeter controls. But the problem with that was, firstly, we started to see lateral movement. We see if the parameter is breached, which we see very often, once the attacker is inside your environment, they can laterally move into your environment, into your network, and basically not being able to access all your applications and data using, let's say, compromised credentials. The second thing was that the insider threats. So this particular model did not look for insider threats. So essentially, it was pretty much a flat network. And what we started to do was to create more and more segments to solve that problem. So we started to add more firewalls in our environment. We created these security zone models where we have, let's say, a production environment and non-production environments with firewalls in between. The users were put into their own LAN networks. Then we had a 3-tier architecture where we had the DMZ, the applications, and the database all sitting in their own security zones. But pretty much they were all kind of macro security zones, right? So all applications sitting under one macro security zone, all databases sitting in a one. So basically, if you compromise one, you pretty much have access to hop into all the others. So this solution was basically having these problems with the current threats that we are seeing. The second, another thing that you see basically is that anything that's inside the network was being considered as trusted. So there was pretty much like a binary kind of interpretation of trust. So either you're untrusted or you are trusted. Whereas we know that the concept of trust is that there are certain levels of trust. Yeah, the trust, there's no one binary level of trust. even in the human society, we trust different people differently based on our relationships and our interactions with them. So this model did not work. And what we started to see was that our technologies started to evolve. Our users started to move outside the network, and they were working remotely. They were working from anywhere. Users wanted to access applications and data from over the internet. We saw more and more unmanaged devices like BYOD devices being used by the users. The business applications, they started to move in the cloud. We saw more and more SaaS applications being used. So your Microsoft 365, your Dynamics, a lot of these business ERP, CRM solutions, Salesforce being used as SaaS solutions. We saw more and more data moving into the cloud storage like OneDrive, Dropbox, and so on. And the applications, they were no longer being hosted in your server rooms, in your data centers. They were moving into the public cloud. And this whole parameter started to disappear. It basically was dissolving. So that was where the technologies, where the application technology started to change. We are seeing an environment where the parameter is no longer relevant. In fact, the parameter is disappearing. And then we are seeing, because of this change, more and more increased attack surface because of the distributed nature of applications, the data, and the users. That pretty much increases the attack surface, which now needs to be protected. So how do we move towards a zero trust model where we don't rely on the network and on the parameter controls? Instead, we provide more trust based on the identity and on the data-centric side of things. So we talk about the zero trust principles. The first zero trust principle is never trust, always verify. So we say that we treat each user, device, or resource as untrusted, irrespective of their location in the network. Yeah. So every user, a device, and resource has to be verified before they are given access to a resource. And the second thing is that we not just basically create trust based on a single credential, on a single authentication factor, but we are going to use a range of contextual factors, whatever is available, as much as possible to create the trust and to be able to identify what is the risk of providing access. So providing strong authentication with multi-factor authentication of the identity, authenticating the device, looking at the way the user is coming from in terms of location, the behavior, is that a normal pattern for them to access this resource, making dynamic risk-based access decisions, and doing that on a continuous basis. That is basically the kind of nirvana where we need to reach for zero trust. The second principle is applying least privilege access. So essentially making sure that the resources or identities are only being provided least privilege access. So fine-grained access policies ensuring only the least privilege access is being provided. And the third very important principle is assuming breach. So we assume that the environment that we have, the network, is already compromised. We assume that the adversary is already present in our environment. How are we going to protect our resources, our users, our devices in that environment? How do we verify all the connections, encrypt all traffic? So we assume basically that we are working on the internet pretty much. The corporate network is pretty much your internet. And you're continuously monitoring for suspicious activities that are happening. So these are the three very key principles of zero trust. And I think if you take away one thing from this presentation, remember these three principles: never trust, always verify, applying the least privilege access, and assuming breach. And what we are going to do is we're going to take these three principles and then we're going to start applying it to these 5 pillars of zero trust. These are identity, device, application, network, and data. And then we have horizontally across them, we have visibility and analytics, automation and orchestration, and governance to be provided around them. But the 5 pillars are these identity, device, and so on. And what we need to do is to apply those 3 principles to each of these 5 different pillars. So essentially what it means is, with an identity, we never trust any identity, never have any inherent trust in an identity. We always verify, which means we need to have strong authentication on the identity of the user or a system identity that's trying to access your resource. Similarly, second thing, we need to provide least privilege access to the identity, so that even if that identity gets compromised, even if it has multi-factor authentication, it gets compromised, we are restricting the blast radius, we are restricting the attack surface to only the least privilege access that identity provides. And thirdly, we are assuming breach. We assume that the credentials will get compromised, which we see every now and then. We need to assume that the breach has happened, and then how can we basically have controls to protect it? So similarly, these 3 principles of zero trust, we need to apply to each of these different 5 pillars of Zero Trust. The next is about looking at the Zero Trust capability maturity. So if we take these 5 pillars and then we identify, okay, what are the different capabilities that we would need to actually protect them, and then map it against the levels of maturity. So if you see on those columns, level 1, level 2, level 3, these are levels of maturity that you need to achieve for each of these different 5 pillars. And again, every organization will have its own requirements and its own maturity model where it needs to be. So for example, every organization is different. And if you are in a highly trusted, let's say you're a defense organization, you want to be at level 3, you want to be highly secure in terms of all these pillars. Whereas if you are, let's say, a smaller e-commerce platform, you may have a different maturity requirement. So if you look at the identity, the goal is to provide strong authentication. So we are not relying on any single factor for authentication. So we're not relying on any passwords. We want strong identity authentication using multi-factor authentication to combine with least privilege access provided to that identity. And the best would be to have continuous verification based on a combination of factors, not just the identity, not just doing the multi-factor authentication, but looking at the behavior of the user, the device that they are accessing from, location, and the risk of that particular access, and then making a risk-based, dynamic risk-based decision. So for that, we start off with, let's say, the level 1 would be at least to have single sign-on in your organization. So every users have one identity, which one set of credentials which they're using to access. That's the least level, right? We don't want users to have hundreds of different passwords, which obviously will get compromised. Having identity lifecycle management, so the process for automated provisioning and deprovisioning, and identity federation, where we can federate with our cloud services so that they are using the identity of the organization. The second level would be to have multi-factor authentication, so providing strong authentication using biometrics and those kind of things, providing privileged access management, ensuring that the privileged access is well protected, and having identity governance with processes to evaluate the identity, the access that was provided to the user on a regular basis. And the highest level, the level 3 that we would be looking at, is having passwordless authentication. So using your trusted device, your biometrics to authenticate, having a continuous risk-based authentication where you're looking at the strong authentication, the device, the location of the user, the behavior to make a risk-based decision, and having just-in-time access for, if they need some privileged access, we provide just-in-time and just enough access for them to access that resource. So this is the kind of maturity which we need to have. And this is one example of a capability maturity model. There are various capability maturity models available. I think recently the US government also issued a capability maturity model for Zero Trust. It's the Cybersecurity and I think the Infrastructure Agency, which has recently published a draft of a capability maturity model. So you can use any capability maturity model and map where your organization sits currently and where do you want to be after whatever number of years or whatever your target state is, and then identify what capabilities you would need to actually achieve that. So that was example for identity. We will not go through everything for all these, but let's just quickly go through the goals that we have for each of these different pillars. So for device, we want device authentication, we want device security posture verification, and we want the enhanced endpoint visibility to ensure that only the trusted devices can access resources. So we have enough endpoint telemetry and endpoint visibility that we have enough trust on the device that is accessing our resources. If we talk about applications, we want our applications to be secure by design. As part of the Zero Trust, we want to have continuous security testing, which is built into the development and the deployment process for that application. We want access to the applications to be based on a strong user and device authentication and using least privileged access. So what are the type of technologies that we will be building? That's basically defined over here. And again, it's pretty much for every organization would have their own needs and their own requirements. So if we talk about, let's say, the level 3, it would be having automated application security testing, which is built into your CI/CD pipelines. You break the build if it doesn't pass the security testing. You have continuous verification of the user's access based on identity, device, and location to provide access to your application. We talk about the next pillar, which is network. So we consider the corporate network is untrusted. So it's pretty much our internet is now the new corporate network, right? So where we are users accessing the SaaS applications and your cloud applications directly over the internet. Even your corporate network, we consider same, it's untrusted. And we need controls implemented to ensure only the authorized entities can communicate with each other, irrespective of the location. So we will look at like ingress, egress, traffic filtering and monitoring, secure web gateways. That's level one, right? Where we had want to control what's the north-south traffic that is coming into our network. And we talk about level two, it's encrypting the traffic, cloud-based web gateways, internal network segmentations. And if you look at the more advanced level three kind of controls we would need is micro segmentation, where we basically have such small segments that, if a user needs to talk to, let's say, 5 applications, those are the only 5 applications that they will be able to reach in the network, and they will not be able to, connect to any other resources in the network. That level of micro segmentation is possible with this kind of controls. We have network access controls to authorize what devices are connecting to our network, visibility and threat monitoring. So essentially having controls to have visibility into the traffic in the network, being able to decrypt the traffic that's coming, both the north-south traffic and the east-west traffic within our environment, and identifying threats based on, let's say, machine learning models and behavior of the entities that are residing in our network. And then we have controls like ZTNA, Zero Trust Network Access, and per application VPNs to provide secure remote access to users who are sitting outside our network. The data is the goal for us would be to protect the data at all times, regardless of its location. So whether the data is sitting in the on-prem repositories, whether it's in the cloud repositories, on the end user devices, BYOD, wherever the data is, the protection resides with the data itself. And we have things like discovery and classification of sensitive data, so we know what our sensitive data is, where the sensitive data resides, and having strong access controls and visibility on how the data is being used and the movement of data. And for that, these are the different types of controls that we would be implementing. Now, bear in mind, these are 5 pillars. Usually, most organizations, they start off with identity. As we say, right, identity is the new parameter. As the network parameter is dissolving, the identity becomes the core focus. So the more solutions that we have for Zero Trust, they are more identity-centric, they're more device-centric. So having a strong view of your identity and a strong focus on the device, that is very important. So more and more organizations would focus on these 2 pillars first. Applications and network. If you want to change your applications and network, obviously that would be more disruptive to the business. If you want to do more network segmentations and so on, that can break your environments as well. So if you are doing a good job with the identity and device, you pretty much make these application, network, and data, they are more kind of defense in depth, right? So if you do a really good job, really strong identity solution and a device authentication, that really reduces the risk of your environment. And then you can have some of these controls with the application, network, and data to further reduce the vulnerabilities. But the focus should be identity and data and your device security. Right, so not sure how much time I have left, but talk about how do we embark on the Zero Trust journey. So essentially, what you start off with, basically, so a lot of security leaders, they're not sure where do they start in the Zero Trust journey. As we saw in the last slide, there's so many different technologies, there's so many different pillars. The first thing that any organization should do is to incorporate the Zero Trust in their strategy. So first, to be able to assess their own maturity within the Zero Trust journey. Where do they stand today? What is their baseline? And then from there, they should identify, okay, what are the use cases that they need to prioritize? What are the problems that they need to solve? What will be the quick wins that they can do for their organization from a Zero Trust perspective and so that they can move towards that target state? Remember, the target state will be different for every organization. As I said, I mean, you can be a nuclear power plant. Your target state will be completely different from, let's say, if you are a retail, a supermarket, or an e-commerce platform, right? So your target state has to be unique for every organization, which means that your Zero Trust journey will be unique for every organization. So you start off with identifying where you are currently, what is the target state you need to be, and then identifying what are the initiatives and investments required to reach the target state. And then you create a roadmap of how you will deliver and achieve Zero Trust over that period of time. So start off with the strategy and then get the executive and board members buy-in. So business should see it as an enabler. You need to basically, the security leadership should be able to convince their executives and board members why they need to move towards a Zero Trust journey. Why has it become a necessity? How does it enable the business? The business may have certain priorities in terms of digital transformation, in terms of moving into the cloud. So we need to basically explain to the business how zero trust would help them achieve those strategic outcomes. Sorry, Ali, is that from a time perspective, am I doing well, or how much time do we have left?
Yep, we are almost there.
Okay, so let me just quickly finish up the slides in the next 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Providing clarity and the outcomes to the executive. So that's the second point we discussed. And then inculcating the zero trust mindset and culture within the organization. So you start off with basically incorporating zero trust within your security standards, your architecture principles, making sure that anything new being developed must comply with those zero trust principles as much as possible, as much as whatever the security controls that you already have in your environment, make sure everything follows the zero trust principles. That's basically starting off with the zero trust journey. Next, when we say what the step would be to identify your use cases and requirements. So as I mentioned, you have done your strategy. Now you need to know what are the use cases that you need to prioritize. You can't solve all the problems at once. So you need to prioritize which ones are going to give you the most benefit. So do not select a product first before you have identified your requirements and your use cases. That's very important. And I think that's one of the mistakes which we see a lot of security leaders making today. Focusing on identity and device security. So as I mentioned today, right, that device is basically an identity. This is your new first line of defense, right? The perimeter no longer exists. So users are using their identity to authenticate with business applications residing in the cloud. So identity and device should be your first line of defense. It should be your priority to have strong identity and device security. And this provides the most security benefits and also improves the user experience. And it will be relatively less disruptive as compared to having network and application transformations happening to start with. If you are moving towards cloud, using cloud native security controls will really help to accelerate the adoption of zero trust, because we have native controls available within the cloud that help us achieve zero trust. Like you have least privileged access with identity and access management controls, micro-segmentation with security groups, and so on. And identifying and prioritizing critical assets. So you need to know what are your key assets that you need to protect. You can't basically start with protecting everything. So when we start off, you need to know what are the high value assets that you need to protect with the zero trust solutions. In terms of key considerations, remember that technology is evolving. So if you do choose a particular vendor solution, that solution, you don't know how long that would be available in the market, because the technology keeps evolving. So make sure you choose solutions which provide for vendor flexibility, and you avoid any vendor lock-ins in your architecture. Remember, the cost is going to be a factor. Implementing zero trust across the enterprise, across the 5 different pillars, is going to be a costly investment. It's not trivial. So you prioritize your use cases, you choose your use cases that you want to implement, and then you pilot to demonstrate the benefits to your business. Some of the solutions can cause business disruption, like network segmentation. So you need to be careful of what you select as a solution, and make sure you do not choose your most critical and the high value application to pilot. I basically saw one bank basically trying to secure their payment gateways, and they said, okay, we're going to have micro-segmentation for the payment gateways. That created a lot of anxiety within the executives, because they thought if this breaks, the whole payment system stopped working. So make sure you don't choose such high-value assets to prove the technology and to do your pilot kind of deployments. There will be a lot of legacy solutions in your environment which may not support the modern zero trust technology. So you may not be able to implement zero trust everywhere, and we may just need to wait for these legacy solutions to retire, or you choose some other type of technologies to protect them. And finally, the stakeholder support is very important throughout the journey, right? This is going to be a long journey. If you're implementing zero trust throughout the enterprise, ensure the stakeholder buy-in throughout the journey, demonstrate benefits to them to get the business ownership. And lastly, it is a journey, right? So it's going to be an incremental process to move towards the target state. So every organization will be unique, and they will have their own kind of a journey towards achieving zero trust. So to summarize, basically the last slide, zero trust is an enterprise security model of choice. It's not a specific product. It's not a specific technology. It's basically based on a guiding set of principles. We talked about those 3 different principles are never trust, always verify, applying the least privileged access, and assuming breach. We take these 3 principles and we apply to the 5 pillars of zero trust, which is identity, device, application, network, and data. And then we identify, okay, what capabilities and controls do we need in our environment to achieve a particular maturity in the zero trust journey. Remember, we start with incorporating zero trust in the security strategy. So we identify where we are in the security, in the zero trust journey, perform a maturity assessment, and then define your target state. Know the use cases, know the requirements before you jump into any products or any solutions. We have to be very clear what your requirements are before you select a solution. And lastly, zero trust is going to be a journey. It will be a gradual process, but zero trust is here to stay. You're seeing the US president talking about it. You're seeing other governments and entities talking about it. Each organization will be unique and will have its own journey. So I think that's the last message, that, make sure that you plan it out and you show the benefits and the how it reduces risk to your business and to your stakeholders. I think that's pretty much wraps up my presentation, and I think if we have time, we can take any questions.
Thank you. That was really good topic, I would say. As I mentioned in the start, it's a hard topic, and whenever you talk to the vendors and the solution providers, I think zero trust is the thing they are talking about. But I think it's good, when we discuss the 5 pillars of zero trust, including identity, device, application, network, and data. So the question we have, as you already mentioned in your slide, that if an organization go to that journey to have a zero trust implementation meeting the 5 pillars, that would be a costly journey, is it?
Absolutely, it will be quite costly if you choose all the 5 pillars at once. Yep.
So is it possible? The question is is it possible the organization is not much mature in the security maturity as well as in the budget as well to getting from the board, buy-ins and the budgets and all that stuff. They can tick the box like 2 pillars or 3 pillars out of 5, and they can still say, we are like a sort of a compliant. Are we meeting the zero trust architecture, or you have to be fully compliant, like meeting 5 pillars?
No, absolutely. You have to choose your own use cases, and you have to know what is important to you. Every organization will be different. If you're talking about, let's say, a nuclear power plant where it doesn't have any internet-facing users, has very highly critical applications, the network-based security, the network pillar will probably be more important for those type of NI. But if you're talking about a more cloud-centric environment, or more cloud-centric organization, then the identity and the device, because the users are accessing from anywhere, those pillars will be more important. So you need to choose your use cases, and absolutely, you're right. Nobody will be able to be 100% across all these 5 pillars. In fact, we haven't seen anyone, irrespective of how much budget they have, to achieve 100% throughout their environment. So what we need to do is to basically progress step by step, incrementally, and choose what are the areas where you need to invest. And as I said, most organizations right now are focusing on identity and device. The 2 reasons for it: one, the solutions here are more mature. The identity solutions are more mature, the device solutions, and we have good solutions available to provide risk-based authentication and based on the device security posture. And these basically 2 pillars can help you reduce a lot of the risk within your organization, which means the other pillars like application, network, and data, they pretty much becomes defense in depth. Your network becomes less relevant if you have a very strong identity solutions. So absolutely, very good question, and we need to choose the use cases.
Thank you. The next question is it the same architecture applies on the industrial control systems or operation technology architecture as well? Because mostly these specific ICS, the PLC infrastructure and SCADA infrastructure, most have the legacy environment. So does that apply to same ICS environment as well?
We can apply the same principles. The zero trust principles will always apply irrespective of the use case and irrespective whether it's an IT environment or the OT environment. So even for those OT SCADA environments where there's legacy protocols and legacy applications running, you can apply the same principles, but the controls, the technologies, and the solutions will be different. So for example, if it's a OT environment which you want to isolate or have some kind of a protection, we have other types of controls, network-based controls, let's say one-way diodes, where we can protect or isolate, provide an air gap environment for the SCADA systems. So your controls may be different, but the zero trust principles apply there. There will be possibilities where there are, as I mentioned, legacy applications where you can't apply zero trust because they don't support the zero trust technologies and those kind of things, for which you will need to have more compensating controls built around them. But yes, absolutely, the principles apply to both OT and IT environments.
Thank you. The next question we have, by continuously verifying trust within the network, I assume that we will be always verifying the communication between 2 devices first, and doing it each time will degrade the performance. How zero trust architecture affects the performance of the systems?
It's a very good question, and I think that is one of the concerns that we have if we are doing continuously verification of the information. Does that impact the performance? Again, basically, it can depend upon different types of solutions. So if you're talking about a human user trying to access a particular application, they basically go through some kind of a trust broker, which will identify what's the level of trust in the identity and in the device, and then being able to provide a risk-based decision. And it could be that this is happening in a different, let's say, a control plane and the data plane are separate. So you are connecting directly to the application through the data plane, but in the control plane at the back end, it's again continuously checking whether the device posture has changed, whether the location of the user, the risk has changed. So there are solutions that can be built, but when you basically talk to your vendor, ask them that question of, how does it impact the performance of my application if it's doing continuous verification? Is there any way in which it can protect it? So there are different types of solutions. There are end user initiated solutions. There are gateway based solutions, and different solutions will have different ways in which they can do continuous verification.
Cool. And the last question we have, they understand that zero trust architecture would be a costly thing, but don't you think if a single machine, how it changes the threat landscape, if an organization has implemented zero trust architecture, like if a single machine is compromised, would not that be possible to attack other machines in the same vulnerability in the same environment if it's not zoned properly?
And that is exactly the problem we are trying to solve, that, we assuming breach. The third principle is that you will be breached. You will have machines in your environment that are compromised, endpoints that will be compromised. And that's where we want to make sure that we never trust any device, right? We always verify. So even if one device has been compromised, that device only has access to, firstly, a specific applications. They cannot access the whole network. They cannot spread ransomware or malware into all the other environments. And then every time this device tries to make a connection to a resource, we are trying to authenticate based on a number of factors: the identity of the user, the device security posture. If we have, let's say, a security endpoint solution, let's say an EDR solution running, we would try to see if there are any alerts coming from that particular device. And making a risk-based decision whether to allow access to that device or to that from that device. And then so that's exactly what we are trying to do, is to we assume that the devices will be breached, but we want to reduce the blast radius from that device. We don't want the malware to spread into the environment, by providing least privilege access and always verifying based on a number of factors, not just on the one factor of the user's identity.
Cool. Thank you, Asif. That was the last question we had. And thank you so much for presenting at BSides Islamabad and taking our time for that one. It was really good topic, and I would say close to everyone's heart, because this is the buzzword which everyone is discussing, and you explained it very well. What is the zero trust architecture and why organizations should be going that way.
Thank you very much. My pleasure, and I'm excited to look at to hear all the other exciting presentations today.
Thank you, Asif. Have a good day. Bye.